So this interesting and well-known quote from Sir Isaac Newton from 1676, if I have seen Father, it's by standing on the shoulder of giants, highlights a very important and maybe a basic characteristic of science and research. Namely, that you are not in a vacuum when you are a scientist, when you are doing research. You are actually standing on the shoulder of giants. You really need to acknowledge that science is cumulative, with each new discovery dependent on the previous knowledge. And some years later, another great scientist, Lord Rayleigh, stated that if, as is sometimes supposed, science consisted in nothing but the laborious accumulation of facts, it would soon come to a standstill, cross as it were under its own weight. And I think that's a statement that we really need to consider today, with the amount and numbers of new research paper being published every day is maybe so big and it's unimaginable. And thinking of how Lord Rayleigh would relate to that number, I don't think he had any imagination of the problem here. So what he states is just as important today as it were back in 1884, namely that the work which deserves, but I'm afraid does not always receive the most credit, is that in which discovery and explanation go hand in hand, in which not only are new facts presented, but their relation to old one is pointed out. So we need to acknowledge as researchers that each new result needs to be interpreted in the context of earlier research. Well, the question might be how to do that. And the answer we're giving 100 years later, at least very clearly 100 years later, by Richard Light and David Pillemer, where they stated the fact that synthesis of existing evidence is actually the intermediate step between past and future research. They pointed out in this way that why do scientists think that new research is better or more insightful or more powerful? Well, the underlying assumption must be that new studies will incorporate and improve upon lessons learned from earlier work. Once again, they clearly states researchers are not working in a vacuum. We are standing on the shoulder of giants. Novelty, they wrote, in and of itself is shallow without links to the past. So for science to be cumulative, we need the synthesis of existing evidence, or you could put it in another way, that whenever you are doing a new study, you should be aware in a systematic way about all the earlier similar studies. And one of the way could be a systematic review. So you could state, and I can follow you, you would think that, what are you talking about? No paper has ever been published without reference to earlier published scientific results. So what's really the problem? Or as they put it in a committee some years back, when they were evaluating a new PhD program, where we actually argue that we, in this PhD program, would like the PhD students to learn how to be evidence-based. So the committee wrote in the review that, strictly speaking, it seems hard to imagine any research not evidence-based. And just to underline the point, at least it seems impossible to imagine that articles published in journals with high impact factor do not relate to earlier research. So in one way, yes, there's plenty of references in a scientific paper, but are these references, this citation, are they selected in a systematic and transparent way, or maybe selected in a based upon strategic considerations or preferences? What does the evidence actually tell us? What does meta-research or research on research tell us about the behavior of us scientists or researchers? Here's a study published in 2011 by Karen Robinson and Steve Goodman. They identified 1,523 original studies, which were characterized by the fact that at least 3 similar earlier studies was published, meaning that the authors of each of those 1,523 studies could have referred to 3 and even more different studies. So you can see in this figure here, the numbers just below the x-axis is the number of studies they could have referred to. I don't know if you can read it, but up here you have 20, here you have 10, and so forth. And you have the number below is actually the number of studies that could have referred to either 16 or 17 or so forth. But what are the median number of studies they referred to? No matter how many studies they could have referred to, they referred to 2. They could have referred to 20, they referred to 2. They could have referred to 3, they referred to 2. That's one thing. The other thing they realized was that 55% did not cite any trials of similar types in their new study. So you could state that something strange is going on. At least we can state that a systematic and transparent approach is rarely used when citing earlier similar trials. Another meta-research study were evaluating if authors actually were referring to a systematic review as a justification of the study. 44% did not cite a single systematic review, but 20% actually used a systematic review in order to justify and telling, here we have a knowledge gap, we need this study. But you could put it in another way, 80% did not do that. So we could again conclude that we are lacking a systematic and a transparent approach when authors are justifying new studies. So we could look more clearly to the conclusion from this study. Trialists should use evidence from existing systematic reviews for planning a trial, while edit committees, peer reviewers, editors should require authors to provide evidence that a new trial is indeed necessary. And it is actually, contrary to the situation of Newton's or Lord Rayleigh's time, it is actually possible today to have a systematic approach, actually to provide the evidence of what all earlier studies actually had shown before you argue for the need for yet another study. And a third meta-research study here was evaluating the fact that the National Institute of Health Research in UK have for several years demanded from each of the applicants that they should use a systematic review in order to justify the study. And you can see that in the first cohort, 89% were actually referring to a systematic review, and in the second cohort of this study, 100% were doing that. So this is good, right? No, it's not really good, because this is just tick marking. They are referring to a systematic review, but they are not using the systematic review to design the study. Less than 20%, or maybe even 10% of the different aspects of design were informed by the systematic review. So again, we have here that, first of all, there was no really improvement from the first cohort to the second. And secondly, again, we have a lack of a systematic and transparent approach when you're designing the new study. One thing is to say that we need to be informed by the systematic review, but I mean, it's not just a matter of quoting it. You need to explain and use the knowledge from the systematic review in the selection of the patient, in the selection of the methods used and the outcomes, and so forth. Here's another study, and actually a serious study, where my Clark and colleagues from 1997 over 2001, 2005, 2009, and 2012 were looking randomly of all the randomized clinical trials published in the highest impact journals within medicine, and try to figure out if they use the systematic review not to justify a design, but actually use the knowledge from previous studies to inform the interpretation of the new results. You could say, place the new results in the context. And even though you in 97 had 26 studies, only 2 were doing that. In 2001, no one was doing that. No one was doing it in 2005. And so that you can see there's really no change in the